There's been a lot of discussion all morning about the level of transparency and the level of influence and who are these trade agreements really written for. And I think that these couple of slides put it into stark relief, given that they really give you a visual of what's happening in the United States and the way trade policy is made in the United States, as the U.S. is one of the main drivers of TISA. So this graph shows you the 566 individuals who are officially trade advisors to the Obama administration, who helped the Obama administration establish trade policy. You can see that that big glob is dominated by the blue dots. You don't know who they are yet. And then secondarily by the purple dots. And then maybe there's a grouping of red, and then if you can tell the difference between the yellow and the orange and the green, there's a few others. Well, this is what's really happening there. Blue and purple are both industry. It's whether it's an individual industry or a group of industries. So business is really the main advisor. You can see labor. One of those red dots is my boss, President Richard Trumka of the AFL CIO, which represents about 12.5 million working men and women in the United States. But when he and the presidents of some of his 57 affiliates, obviously not all 57, who sit on this committee, talk to the USTR and the USTR staff about what workers want to see in these trade agreements and how it's not the same thing that we've seen in trade agreements for the past 20 years, you can see that we're outvoted. And this is really what happens when trade policy is made behind closed doors. The people, those who work through mobilization, through education, through sheer numbers rather than through money, are the ones who lose out. And that's what people have been saying in various ways all morning, that when things happen behind closed doors, it's the workers who are left out and the workers' interests who are left out. And that's frankly what has happened with U.S. trade policy over the past 20 years. And all these folks get to see, by the way, in terms of transparency, is the proposed U.S. text before it's put on the table. This system, which the USTR claims is super transparent, doesn't give folks a chance to look at the negotiating text, look at the bracketed text, see where it's going, recommend trade-offs, give that away, don't give that away. Ooh, that's a horrible proposal. Let's reject that one. None of that can happen. Okay. Going back to the transportation, I'm just going to do a very brief overview of the global transportation sector so you know that what we're talking about. Not everyone here is probably familiar with the transport sector. And then taking the very excellent presentations from the morning, if not as a given, if you don't believe them, as one possible scenario, I'm going to talk about what can happen to transportation workers based on what's already happening in the global economy so that you can think about, as a trade unionist, as an NGO, as a representative of a government where your people are counting on you for protection, just what you should do in terms of committing or not committing your transport sector to this agreement that you've heard about all morning. So first of all, we take from the American perspective as a given that neoliberal trade deals contribute to income equality and deregulation by increasing the power of capital at the expense of workers. They make it easier for transnational corporations to use workers against each other as they try to game the system for lower wages and standards, and they threaten workers and say, if you don't take less, if you don't give up your pension, if you don't give up seniority rights, we're moving jobs away. And they're not really about creating decent work or raising standards of living. Or there would frankly be really meaningful rules in them addressing workers' rights in these issues. So, to put it in context, transportation workers, according to the GATS, and TISA is following the GATS, cover workers that you might not even consider as transport workers. It's taxi drivers, it's rental car agencies, it's oil pipelines, it's space workers. You know, who thought NASA was going to be in transport? But it's cargo handling, it's storage, it's warehousing. Deborah talked about this morning. There's an awful lot that it covers, and it's a huge sector of the global economy. In fact, it's such a huge sector that there's not really good data on exactly how many workers worldwide are in the transport sector or how much money it generates worldwide. Even the OECD, which has a really great report on global trade and transport, only figures it in terms of passengers per kilometer or the amount of freight, the tons per kilometer traveled. They don't really give you the impact because I think it's hard to count up what are taxi drivers doing and what is Maersk doing. So, global rail transport, including freight and passenger, 214 billion worldwide by 2016. Freight transport across maritime, rail, air, and road, 2,735 billion, or if you're an American, over almost 3 trillion by 2017. Global air transport plus the jobs created indirectly in freight and passenger, already almost 3 trillion, and U.S. maritime alone, 100 billion, and that's about 500,000 American workers. So, what can this mean for workers? Well, the commitments that your country makes as a negotiator really matter. Will the TISA protect core labor rights? I don't think we heard from one presenter this morning that there's going to be a labor chapter, or if there's a labor chapter, what's going to be in it? So I think that's a real big question. And what sectors of transportation will be covered? The commitments can put workers at greater risk of pressure to take pay cuts, as I've talked about, and international transport sectors like air and maritime provide special opportunities to exploit workers. These risks are real, and we know they're real because they're already happening. So one of the most alarming things that can happen to international transport workers is seafarers who are abandoned in foreign ports. And this actually happens quite a bit. If you haven't heard about it, more than 1,600 seafarers have been abandoned between 2000 and 2010. They're simply left in a foreign country if the shipper decides that it's going to go bankrupt, the vessel's going to be seized, and it just says goodbye. The workers eventually, they're living on the ship, they run out of energy, they run out of food, they run out of water. Generally, they have calling cards to call home, to seek help, to say, I'm still alive, this is what's going on. Those cards run out. And then what do? There was a working group between employers and the Seafarers Union to come up with a protocol about how to deal with this and adjust liability. That hasn't stopped the practice. There's an ILO convention on the protection of maritime workers. That hasn't yet stopped the practice. It'd be interesting to see if one of the negotiators could tell us whether they're talking about requiring as a condition of TISA all of the parties to adopt the ILO Convention for the Protection of Maritime Workers, because if there's any international trade agreement that should protect maritime workers, frankly, it should be the TISA. That's what the TISA is about. And if they're not talking about it, and if they're not talking about a way to stop this practice and to apportion liability to the wrongdoers when it's done, that's a clue that this agreement is really not about making workers better off and protecting their rights. It's about something else altogether. A second one, you see I've got the logo for the U.S. Department of Transportation there. And this is sort of the flag of convenience issue. And many of you have heard about this in the maritime industry. Well, now it's happening in the air transport industry. You may be familiar with NAI. It's a subsidiary of NAS, a Norwegian airline. NAI was established in Ireland, so it gets to avoid Norwegian labor law. And then its crew are subcontracted through an Asian temp firm. So its crew are not necessarily Irish or subject to Irish labor law. Because the United States has, we think pretty smartly, kept air transport services out of its commitments in the GATS in prior FTAs, it has a different system, open skies agreements negotiated by the State Department and then administered by the Department of Transportation. So the U.S. has an opportunity to take the application of NAI to operate in the United States and say yes or no. It doesn't have to say yes because it hasn't committed that. And it can look at the fact that these workers are going to be undermining wages, benefits, and labor standards for American air transport services, which we hope that it does. Our Transportation Trades Department has weighed in on the issue. And to see again how big the transportation sector, the AFL-CIO has 57 affiliates, 32 of them are in the Transportation Trades Department. So we're hoping that the U.S. will weigh in and say, this isn't right. Let's not let aviation companies use flags of convenience to abuse workers. So what about privatization? As you've heard this morning, because of the weak protection for public services, particularly in transportation, this is useful. Think about all of public transportation systems, subways, metros, buses. There's a fare. There's a fare for every rider. That's commercial. These are at risk. The standstill and ratchet effects. Once you've privatized, even if it was of your own volition, it had nothing to do with the trade agreement, are you really allowed to go backwards? Are you really allowed to put regulations in place that weren't there? And the pressure, as was discussed this morning, to open up 90% of services trade, public or even formerly public transport services are at risk. And again, some of you may be familiar with the former British Rail. It's a really popular idea in the UK to bring back British Rail, to renationalize it. The privatization there is widely seen as a failure. The safety has decreased. There have been more deaths of workers. Public subsidies to the rail system are actually up, higher than when it was public rail. The rolling stocks, the actual trains, they're older now on average, so the idea that the private sector was actually going to invest more and upgrade the rolling stock, that's not happening. Overcrowding has increased because there are more riders and the private companies aren't buying more cars to accommodate them. Perhaps the worst part is that average train fares in the UK increased at 3 times the rate of average wages in the UK between 2008 and 2012. So much for the neoliberal article of faith that the private sector is always better. UK train riders are also subsidizing train riders in other European companies because these investors, in many cases, are the national rail systems of France and Germany and the Netherlands. So as UK train riders are paying more, it's enabling train riders elsewhere in Europe to pay a bit less. A study commissioned by RMT, the British Rail Union, said that UK taxpayers could save $1.2 billion a year if they renationalize. So the question is, can they do it now under the current commitments that the EU has made under GATS? Will they be able to after the TISA? It's a very important national decision to get that money back for the taxpayers and to use it for something useful. So if that's not a decision that the UK government can make, what's the reason? Why are we doing trade agreements when sort of neoliberalism is really a fad? What if we had done all these trade agreements 50 years ago, and instead of locking in neoliberalism, we had locked in the New Deal and the Marshall Plan? Would have been very different. So what about the question of local control? Public services should be just that, public for the public. Governments have the right and the obligation to direct that service providers serve low-profit neighborhoods, rural, sparsely populated, low-income, places where a private provider might not want to go, for instance. But will the private providers fight regulations that mandate equitable services as too trade restrictive? Maybe. There's so little guidance from the GATS. I went through all the cases to see if there was a case on public services, and there hasn't yet. And so we don't know. And so there was a comment this morning about everything's black and white. It's not that it's black and white. It's that it's your obligation as a representative of your people to figure out what these obligations mean and what the trickiest, most insidious lawyer might argue that they mean as a way to hurt your public. And if there's some way to twist the words to use it against your people, to change the language and not go along with that. That's the obligation. So that's why we say these things can be used against you. So, and then last, this is just a sample that TISA commitments matter. This is the U.S. transport commitments under the GATT, you can see it's really not very much. You know, we think as U.S. workers, the U.S. did a fairly good job of not going all the way and liberalizing everything. And so obviously we say, when the U.S. is asking other countries to commit a lot, look at what the U.S. has done. Is there some imbalance there? Probably. Think about that. And on the one hand, you can say, well, that's protectionist, that's what unions always do, blah, blah, blah. We actually like trade. We support the GSP program, which is the lowering of tariffs. We put in a proposal to add more products to the AGOA program, which is low tariffs for developing African countries. So this is not a question of protectionism. This is a question of how do you best provide services to your public, whether private services or public services, and we're asking you to consider that. Thanks very much.